Okay, so we're going to start kind of looking at that next step in our process, and that's going to be creating the assembly model with the 5 parts that are in our crankshaft assembly. So as we look, I'm going to look underneath our camera here, and if you need to, I just want to remind you, in our learning plan number 1, you're going to notice that there is a crankshaft assembly tutorial here, okay? I made a copy of this for you. This is a PDF out of a different book that is more that tutorial, step 1, step 2, step 3. And this particular tutorial is focusing on putting an assembly together, but then also animating it and moving it around to see its motion. So this is going to be the tutorial PDF that you want to reference, and I already have mine underneath my screen here in its hard copy form. So as we look at this, at the beginning, we talked about this the last time we were together, and as we went forward, we noticed that starting on page 13.7 was the start of the 5 parts that are going to go in to create this assembly. Okay, so the first part was the end cap. And as I told you, make sure that you save your file as the part number here, 20010. Okay, the second part is the connecting rod. That's 20020. Okay, the next one was the base block, 20030. Okay, then there was the crankshaft, 20040, and then the piston, 200500 or 50. So job number 1 is to create each one of those models. Job number 2 is what we're going to be looking at today, is going to be creating the assembly. Okay, now the assembly file is going to be file number 20100. So it's kind of like the overarching part number for all the other ones that are down below. Okay, so what we are going to do is we're going to use this tutorial to kind of walk through that process, and I'm going to get you started. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. And the reason I'm not going to, because again, I want to remind you, this is a capstone course. I'm going to kind of get you going, but then I'm going to let you kind of continue on, and you have the tutorial here to help you through, and or me as a resource to help you as well. So you're going to notice here that we are going to open up Creo, and we're going to start a new assembly. So I'm going to go to Creo, and I already kind of X'd out of my little boxes. Also make sure that you set your working directory. I already have mine set up, because even if we're pulling files in, it has to know because where we're going to actually put this. If you don't set that, then when you start doing things, it's going to act a little wonky. You'll end up having to start over. So make sure you set that working directory. Now what we're going to do is we're going to create something new. We're going to create a new assembly model. So I'm going to hit new. And now instead of part, I'm going to click on assembly. Okay. I'm also going to uncheck use default template. Okay. And then the file name here is going to be the 20100. Okay. Do not put crank slider assembly. Okay. And then of course it already exists. I've got to do an _1. You guys do the, done it a couple times. I'll do _3. Okay. All right. Then when we get to this next screen, this is going to be the template that we want to actually grab. And it's going to be the inch pounds assembly design ABS. Okay. I believe it's absolute is what it means. And we're just going to hit OK. All right. So now we're ready to start our assembly. So if we look at underneath, what we did is we hit new. We did this process right here. We just hit the OK button. We picked our template, and now we're at this point right here. And let's see, we're actually going to be bringing in our base component. So we're going to click on pick assemble. I'm going to go back over here, and I'm simply going to hit assemble. All right. Now what's going to happen is your working directory is going to come up with the parts that you have created. So again, you can't start this until you have the models of the individual parts done. And my first part, now you want to always think of when you create assemblies, the best place to start is what is the first thing that I need? And the first thing I need is that base block, because that's where everything kind of fits into. And our base block part number is 20030. So it's going to be that part right there. And I'm actually going to pick my underscore 2. All right. I'm going to say open. And now what's going to happen is it goes into this mode where we need to set it up and tell it what it's supposed to do. Now, in here, in our placement, this very first one has to be fixed. We want it to we don't want it to move around in space. And because it's the first one in here, SolidWorks does this automatically when we pull that first one in, but Creo, we need to intentionally say to fix it so that it's not going to move around in space. And all we're going to do in this placement here, it says automatic. We're going to go down and we're simply going to click on fix. And this is only for the first part that we pull in, okay? Because it needs to know in space where it's at. And then you're going to notice that you get your green check mark up in the upper right-hand corner-ish, and we're going to hit okay. I'm also going to get rid of me. I forgot about that. We'll get rid of me so we have more space that we can see. All right, now we've got our part fixed, if you would, and at this 0, 0 is going to be the, if you would, coordinates of the base coordinates of this assembly. Now, the other thing that I think is nice to do when we pull our parts in, it's always going to give them that gray look to it once we have them placed. So I'm going to reselect on our base. And I'm going to go to appearance and I'm just going to change its color to something more exciting. Okay. You can play around with that if you want to, but I do think it's nice that especially when we see the final assembly, it's nice to have different colors so we can differentiate where one part starts and the other part ends or whatever. Okay. So this is here. So now I'm ready to pull in my next part. Let's go underneath and see where we're at. So on this first page where the base component that we pulled in, that base block, 1313, we went through, we pulled that in, we identified it as fixed. Okay, we said hit accept, and now we're ready to pull in our next part, which is going to be the crankshaft. Okay, so now we're going to go back to Creo, and we're going to click on that assemble button again. This is how we're going to pull in our next part. So I'm going to click on that. What's going to happen now is it's going to go back to our working directory where we can pick up whichever the next part is that we want to do. And this part is going to be 20040. Okay. And I'm going to hit open. And now it pulls in my crankshaft and it just kind of places it over by our base block. Now, when we are in this mode, we have the ability, and I like to do this in any parametric software that I'm working in. I like to reduce the number of decisions that the software has to make. Okay. So you'll notice that right now I have the ability using the arrows that we have on the part to kind of get this a little bit closer to where I want it to go. Now it doesn't have to be perfect. Okay. Again, because we're gonna give it some clues on where it should be, but it is kind of nice, especially when we're having to pick on things, if we're, sort of in the vicinity of where things should go. Okay, so now you're gonna notice that up on the top, it says here that we wanna set our connection type to be a pin. So, and that is identified on page 1314. So this is going to be a pin connection, and it's going to be between, I know it's hard to see here. I'm actually going to point on Creo. It's going to be between this part of the shaft and where it sits, what I call the cradle on that base block. Okay. Now what we are going to do is we're going to call that a pin connection. A pin means that those are going to share the same axis and it's going to allow it to spin around in there. So we're going to go from the connection type, we're going to go down to pin. Okay. And now when I have a pin connection, there are two things that I need to identify. I need to identify the axes of each one of the objects, because what is the shared axis that they're going to have, but then also placement or translation, they call it, like where it's going to be. So the first thing we're going to do, it's asking me here for axis alignment. All right. So what we need is we need to go in here. Now, the thing that needs to happen is that you have to have your axes on, not only in the assembly, but also in the individual models. So right now, when I hover over this part of that shaft, you'll notice that I see highlight my axis, okay? If you don't see that, make sure you go up here and that you have the all selected so that you can see we're going to need the planes as well, and we're going to need the axes. So make sure that those are on. So I'm going to hover over this one. I'm going to click on it, left click. I want that axis, and then I need the other one, which is on the base block going through the center of where it's going to be. So now what it did is it aligned those two axes for me. Okay, so right now they're in alignment, but it's still not in the right place. So what I need to now do is that's where we see the translation. So because I picked pin, I need both the axis and alignment and the translation. Now I want the center plane. So this is why when we create those models, pay attention to where the planes are and how they're constructed. So now I can take the center plane of my crankshaft and the front plane of my base block. I was trying to think of the name of it, my base block. And we're going to align those two so that now that's going to set exactly where that's going to be. So whichever, you don't have to, you can pick one or the other first. So I'm going to do the center plane here, this vertical plane on my crankshaft. And then I'm going to do the vertical plane on my base block. And now, because those are in alignment, it sets the position for where that shaft is going to be. So it's along the axis here. Okay, so it's in place for me. And then the planes, those vertical planes, share the same space as well. Okay. Now you'll notice that at this point, you could add, more to it, but we don't need to. We know we're fully defined, if you would, and we're ready to accept this when the green check mark appears. Until we have at least these two, these are the two minimum that we need for this type of a connection. Until we have these two, that'll be grayed out. It won't be available to us. Okay. So now I'm going to hit OK. All right. I'm going to reselect back on 20040. I'm going to give it a different color. We'll make it yellow. Okay. And again, just for ease of looking at rather than it all being grayed out. Okay. So let's go back underneath our camera here and kind of catch ourselves up. So this was the crankshaft. We did the pin. We aligned the two axes first. I know these illustrations are a little dark here. That's why doing this here works. It's 14. Okay. And then 15 is over here. Then it was the translation and lining up the two vertical planes. Okay. And then hitting OK or accept. All right. So now as we turn the page, we are ready to add in our next. And this is going to be the connecting rod we're going to add in. Okay. So the connecting rod is 20020. So go back to Creo. And just like the last part, we're going to click assemble. And then we're going to pull in 20020. I have _2 just so it's a separate part. I've done this a couple times. And now my connecting rod is in. Okay. Now here you're going to notice I'm going to shift. I'm going to push this over and then I'm going to rotate this around. Here again, this is all the way kind of in the front. I need it to be kind of here-ish. Okay. And then I'm going to move this in a little bit. And this is just to, again, minimize the number of decisions that Creo has to make so that we have an easier time kind of pulling it together. And where it's going to go is it's going to go right in between on our crankshaft. It's going to share that space. Okay. So the width of this is going to be right in the middle here. So this is going to be another pin connection because we want it to rotate. We want them to share a rotational axis. So we're going to go up to the top here. We're going to say this is going to be a pin connection. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to align the axes. So again, make sure your axes are on. The first axis I'm going to grab is going to be on my crankshaft. Okay. And the second one, and this one's going to be the harder one to see, is going to be on my connecting rod, and that's going to be in the front here. It's right, pretty sure it's right there. Yeah, right there. It's a short little axis. Can you guys find yours? Might have to manipulate around a little bit. Okay. It's going to be the center or the axis of that radius. Who sees their axis? I don't see anybody raising their hand. Okay, if you don't have an axis or if you don't see one, this is what you need to do. Okay, so I'm gonna hit escape here. I really want to cancel? Yes. So what I'm gonna do, so if you don't see an axis there on your connecting rod, I want your attention, okay? We're gonna have to go back to the individual part. So I'm gonna open up my 20020. Okay. And if you do not have an axis in the front here, and you might not, okay, you might not a big deal. First of all, make sure that they're on here, okay? And if you don't see it, and mine is right there, then what you can do is you can just create one, okay? And you do need one because we have to align the axis, and it may not have it because of the radius here. So to add an axis, super duper simple. All we do is on the model level, we're going to click on axis, and it wants you to select your reference. You're just going to click on the surface of that half circle, and then it's going to add that axis in there. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, and then you can just hit OK. I'm not going to hit OK because I already have one. I don't want an axis on an axis. So I'm going to hit cancel here. I'm going to say, yes, I want to cancel, but you are going to hit OK. And then what you're going to see populate over here, it's going to be an A underscore a number. And that number is going to just signify like however many axes you have on there. It's the next axis, in there. Now, before you leave this, you want to do a file save so that it saves it with that model. Okay. You can keep this model open, not a big deal. And all we're going to do is we're going to go down at the bottom here. We're going to go back to our assembly. And then we're just going to re-pull in. I'm going to re-pull in that 200. Okay. And now it should have that axis in there. And again, I'm going to kind of maneuver this around, push this back. I'm going to pull it up, kind of get it close-ish to where it's going to go-ish. You don't have to be perfect about this, but again, trying to minimize the number of decisions it has to make. All right. Now, again, we're going to go back up to user defined, and we're going to set that at pin. And now we're going to find those two axes. So I'm going to grab, I like looking on the top here. I want this axis right here and this axis right here. So when you go over the top of it, and now what it's going to do is it's going to align those two. Okay. So they just share now the same axis, but notice that it's free to move back and forth this way. So we need to identify, and that's the translation, like where do we want that placed? So again, when we created this model, if you did it the way that it showed where the axes would be in this tutorial, then you're going to have an axis going right through the middle of that part. That's what we want. We want that vertical axis to match the vertical axis of our crankshaft. So we are going to click on that vertical plane. And the vertical plane, hold on, kind of move this around of my crankshaft right there. And now what that did is it aligned those two so you can see that those are in alignment, okay? Rather than trying to, center it some other way or put a dimension in there, now we have, their center planes are going to be coincident. So now you'll notice that you have the green check mark available. So we're going to hit OK. And then I'm going to go on 220 and I'm going to change that to, we'll change it to green. Okay. Again, you can pick whatever color you want. Try not to get too crazy with some of the, I don't know, there's some weird backgrounds in there. Please don't do that. It's harder for me to look at. Again, it's for ease of seeing where one part starts and stops to the next one. Okay, not a bad time to quickly do a save. Then you do save and save. And then this is the first time, so it just wants to confirm it. Make sure it's going back to your working directory. The next times that we hit save, it's not going to ask us to do that. Okay, so let's look at where we're at in the tutorial. Okay, so we've got our connecting rod in place. We did 16. And then we align these two planes, and then we hit accept at the end. So now we're ready to add our piston. Our piston is going to slide back and forth. So this is going to be a slider connection instead of a pin connection. So go back to our assembly. We're going to click on assemble. And this is 20050. Okay. And our piston is in here. So I'm just going to move our piston kind of back and up-ish, right about there. And here we're going to change this to connection type 2 slider. Okay. Here again, we want to align the axes. So make sure your axes are on. I have the axis of my piston and then the axis of that bore. Now it's a half bore, so sometimes Creo doesn't like to put them in there. So if you need to, even though your base is in here, I know my connection is incomplete. I'm going to cancel it for a second. You can do that same thing we did earlier. We can go in and we can open up that base block, which is 20030. So it's the 30. And what you can do is you can add an axis here if you need to. So on the model level, you would click axis, you would select the cylindrical surface, and then it would add an axis in there for you. You hit OK if you need it. I'm hitting cancel because I don't want it to do it again. Do I really want to cancel? Yes. And then you're going to save it so that it's there. And then you're going to go back over to your model of your assembly, and you should now see an axis there again, in case you didn't have one before, and then make sure that it's, on here. So now I'm going to pull my piston back in. That was 50. Okay. And I'm going to pull this back and up. We're going to change that to slider. I'm going to align the axis of my bore to the axis of my piston. There it is. Okay. And rotation. And I also have to, so there's two parts to this again. So now we need to align. Hold on one second. I just want to make sure that I'm not forgetting anything. Crankshaft, slider, two centers, the translation. Oh, the vertical planes again. Yep. I just wanted to make sure that that was the case. So we just want to grab the vertical plane on our piston. Okay. And the vertical plane of our block base right there. Okay. Now, before we leave this one, we need to also connect it to the end bore of our connecting rod. Okay. So we could say, okay, here. All right. And we have the minimum requirements, but we want to add a new set. So we're going to click on new set. And what we are going to do is we are going to, I think I have to do a cylinder. Yep. We're going to change our connector type to a cylinder. And we're going to go on the center line of that end bore on the connecting rod to the center line between those two smaller holes on our piston right there. And now it pulled those two together. Do you see that? Okay. And then because this was a pin over here, it rotated and it still has the same relationship, the front end of our connecting rod to our crankshaft. Okay. All right. So this one has a little bit of an extra, and that is in the tutorial. All right. It tells you to do that. So now we're good. We're going to hit OK. And then here again, I am going to go on my piston. I'm going to change the color. We'll make it red. How about that? Okay. All right. Now we don't have a pin going through there, but we want the axes of those holes to align, and that'll still be okay. Then the last part that we need to pull in is going to be that end cap. So we're going to click assemble. We're going to do 20010, the 10, and then our end cap is right here. Okay. Pull this over, and I'm going to rotate it a little bit just to give, again, that opportunity so that it doesn't have to make too many decisions. What we want to align here are going to be the centers of the bolt holes from the end cap to the connecting rod. So, so this one can just be a user defined, and we're just going to grab that axis there to this axis here, and it aligns those. Okay. And then, oh, we don't want that to be a distance. We want those to be coincident. Okay. The axes to be coincident so that they share the same center line. Then the next constraint we want to add, so we want to say new constraint, and we want to rotate this around. We want this surface on the connecting rod and this surface on our end cap. We want those two not to be a distance apart. We want those to be coincident so that they are together. And I'm going to rotate this around. And the only thing I want to make sure of is that this is aligned here, and I am not. Do you see how this is off here on the bottom? So I aligned, big here. I aligned the top one here and its surfaces, but I did not align the centers here. So we need to go back down here, and we need to align these two centers on each one of these. So I'm going to do one more constraint. We're going to take the, hopefully I can see it, the axis here. Okay. And the axis, am I going to get there? Hope I can. I'm on my laptop, and so it's harder to see things. I usually like working on a bigger screen. So it just makes it a little bit challenging. There it is. There it is. Okay, I've got those two aligned. So we just want those two centers. So now when I look here, this is perfectly aligned all the way. And then I can hit OK. All right. So, so there you have it. Then I've got my end cap in place. I'm going to leave that one gray because that's still a different color than the other ones that I have, and it's my last one anyway. All right. So now is a good time to do a file, save. Okay. And we should be good to go. Now, you can leave all of the planes and the axes on, or you can turn them off. But this would then be the model that you would take a screenshot of, showing your design tree with all the parts in place for the assembly model assignments. Okay, so this can just be a screenshot. You don't have to do the file. Okay, so if I go back over to Canvas and I go to Module 1, the assembly model is what you would add to this assembly. Okay, so the design tree, notice the design tree needs to be visible. The number is here. Include your file name at the top of the screen. So you want to have it large enough that I can see the file name at the top with the model. Okay, so I can see all the parts. All right, any questions about the assembly? If you didn't follow along or I went too fast, that's okay. All right, that's okay. Or if you're not done with all your parts, that's okay. Remember, I followed right along with the tutorial here to put all of these together, and you just want to make sure that you're abiding by the slider, the pin, the cylinder connections that are there, that they're identifying as we go along. Okay, so that is the assembly. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop recording.